I'm substituting for Dr. Alexander Batthyany, who had an urgent family matter that came up suddenly, and he had to cancel the trip to this conference. So I'm going to deliver his presentation, and my apologies to you and to him in advance for anything that I get wrong, if there are any mistakes, misstatements, and so on. The work that he is presenting in this presentation is very important for the field of near-death studies. It is preliminary data on a three-phase study on terminal lucidity, retrospective study of terminal lucidity. Dr. Batthyany is a professor and he is the endowed Viktor Frankl Chair of Philosophy and Psychology at the International Academy for Philosophy in Liechtenstein, and he is a professor in the Department of Cognitive Science at the University of Vienna, Austria. So I feel more like the cow that's sweating, not knowing how these strange visitors will react. Coming in a spaceship called Mutilator. I'm worried not only about the audience reaction here, but most especially Dr. Battyany's reaction to how I have butchered his presentation. So we're talking about the challenge of Alzheimer's and dementia. And we can get a sense from some voices of relatives and friends. And actually, if I could get a show of hands of people in the audience who know of, have had interactions with people with severe dementia. Yes, well, that's quite a few, percentage-wise, certainly. So some relatives and friends have said, "Where has my beloved gone?" It's a slow decline towards death. He's disinhibited, hostile, not just forgetful. Is this what he became? In other words, where is the person I knew? Now, Alzheimer's dementia has been used in philosophical argumentation, and that really calls into question the idea of our personal identity and the soul. There's a well-known philosopher, he's now passed away, Paul Edwards, and he presented in his 1995 book an argument called the Alzheimer argument against the soul. And here's how it goes. Mrs. D was a most kind and elegant elderly lady I knew. She worked at Amherst University and was perhaps the kindest and most generous lady I knew. After she was struck with Alzheimer's, as happens with so many AD patients, all her elegance was gone. She no longer recognized her children, and then in the advanced stage became extremely aggressive. She, who always helped others, was kind to others, suddenly started to beat up other elderly patients. And he goes on. What does that tell us about the dependence of mind and brain? What does it tell us about Mrs. D and so many others, and about you and me? Now, if you say that there is a non-diseased soul in the Alzheimer's patient, you'd need to claim that the soul of Mrs. D did recognize her relatives, but somehow the disease made her behave as if she did not. And do you want to claim that her soul was still the gentle, nonviolent, compassionate lady, but why then would she beat up elderly patients? I think the message is much simpler, unfortunately is also more tragic, and few people will like it. She was the kind Mrs. D when her brain was functioning normally because her brain was functioning normally. And as the AD progressed, her mind was changing alongside the severity of her brain dysfunction. Alzheimer teaches us that our brains are a function of the, our minds are the function of the brain. This is a bleak message, but inescapable. Now, if you're intellectually honest, you would have to admit that Edwards' argument is intuitively compelling, and that materialists' predictions of brain-based consciousness are fulfilled. When the brain has gone, the person has gone. But would that case be as compelling if Alzheimer's disease was only a transitory state, such as psychosis, a dream, drug-induced hallucinations, and so on? What would it be as compelling if Alzheimer's was reversible? Would it be as compelling if Alzheimer's was a state of confusion as we usually know it, but just lasting longer? How long would the remission need to be to decide this? In other words, if it's transitory, if it's going to be over and the person will be back, well, you know, is his argument so compelling? Now, the question of personal identity and the soul has been a long-standing question for Dr. Batthyany. He studied under Viktor Frankl in his early 20s, when Alexander was in his early 20s and when Frankl was in his late 80s. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist, a Holocaust survivor, and the founder of logotherapy, or existential psychiatry. He was the author of Man's Search for Meaning, and held such beliefs that life has meaning under all circumstances, even the most miserable ones. So Dr. Batthyany is now working on Frankl's archives, editing his 14-volume collected works. And this photo shows Viktor Frankl meeting Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, showing the connection between Frankl's and Kubler-Ross's work. Now, most of you know Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was very much involved in death and dying, in near-death studies, and was an early colleague of Raymond Moody. And Dr. Batthyany shared with me that during all of Dr. Batthyany's studies of Frankl's work, Frankl's psychiatric creed puzzled him until he got involved with terminal lucidity and this study that he's reporting on here. Now, Frankl's core idea on the noetic person was formulated in 1950, and it's a belief, a creed, a credo. The belief in the existence and persistence of the noetic person, the soul, even behind the foreground symptoms of psychotic and neurological illness. So, this question then became clearer for him with the realization of terminal lucidity. Alzheimer's is the strongest form of the brain-to-mind determinism. The brain is in total control. Patients forget who they are, what they are, bizarre behavior they have, inhibitions, violence, aggression, and so on. And in the terminal states, there are two interpretations. As the patient is dying, that either what you're observing is an even stronger form of brain determinism, which now is deciding about your existence or non-existence, or it is, as you're dying, the strongest form of self-distancing from the diseased brain, that much like the moon eclipses the sun, the brain eclipses the self. The self is actually completely hidden behind brain functions, even in ordinary consciousness. And in ordinary consciousness, our mental functions are hidden behind and constrained by the brain. So is Alzheimer's a question of the self is gone or the self is dysfunctional? Is the self destroyed or merely disturbed? And Bruce Greyson, who was involved in some of these earlier studies of terminal lucidity, made the argument that only in the extremes do scientific theories break down, only in the extremes. So in classical Newtonian physics, that works well in ordinary conditions, but as at speeds approaching the speed of light and at sizes on the order of the size of atoms, the classical physical paradigm breaks down, and you have relativity theory and you have quantum theory. And an equivalent argument can be made about the extremes of Alzheimer's disease, where the patient is approaching death. When the patient is approaching death, an anomalous phenomenon occurs where the current brain paradigm breaks down. And that's the whole point of this study. So in 2010, Michael Nahm and Bruce Greyson published an article in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease about this new phenomenon that they have called terminal lucidity. The unexpected return of mental clarity and memory shortly before death. And their paper was a survey of the literature going back to early cases, and it was focusing on mental disorders and like schizophrenia, and most of the cases they found were from 1849 or earlier. And subsequently, there was another paper that they and Emily Williams-Kelly and Ellender Haraldson published, and this time it was the Archives of Gerontology and Geriatrics on terminal lucidity, where there was a much larger case collection. But again, many of those were cases from much earlier, up to the early 1900s. And the idea of these studies that Michael Nahm and Bruce Greyson and et al. Have taken up was to get more cases to encourage a more systematic research, because terminal lucidity calls into question the prevailing explanatory model of brain physiology and function. So far, published papers are primarily about very old cases from 100 years ago to 250 years ago, 1700s to early 1900s. Today, we have no idea about prevalence and actually the relevance of terminal lucidity, no idea about the phenomenology and structure, no idea about potential preceding events or causes. And so there's a great deal of reason to do a study. And there are some inherent problems. NDE research blossomed in the 1970s because there was improvement in medical technology and more people were being resuscitated. And therefore more and more reports were forthcoming. Correspondingly, in terminal lucidity research, there was this dearth of actual cases from the early 1900s, probably because the process of aging and dying has become anonymous and impersonal, and especially if you have dementia, and therefore no one pays attention to what happens to you when you die, and whatever they do observe is written off as confusion or hallucination. And so fewer and fewer reports are forthcoming. So a group of physicians, psychiatrists have undertaken the European study on terminal lucidity, ETL, and the first phase is in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, and there will be subsequent phases in the UK, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and then France and the French-speaking parts of Europe. And the intention is to do a retrospective study of TL through a multi-phase survey study. And Dr. Batthyany would like to thank Bruce Greyson, Peter Fennick, and Michael Nahm because of their help in the design of the study. And Bruce Greyson had good ideas on dementia screening. So there were several cautionary measures undertaken in these survey studies. The first is to ask about transient lucidity, not about terminal lucidity, because that's to separate the lucidity from the terminal aspect of it. So if there's a transient lucidity, the patient became clear for a few moments, 6 months ago, is still demented and so on, but there was a transient period of lucidity. And then ask certain questions that will hopefully answer the skeptics and calm them down, and to send out many, many, many questionnaires. Hopefully they will have, by the time the surveys are completed, 4,500 questionnaires completed, and to encourage, not completed, sent out, and encourage non-responders. So some of the questions which are interesting the researchers, is the phenomenon real? So many of the reports are fairly old. Perhaps there was a misdiagnosis. One of the excuses that have been given is, oh, well, back then there was a lot of neurosyphilis, and we don't have syphilis anymore, therefore there's not a problem. Secondly, does this happen in today's high-tech, in this case German, Swiss, and Austrian hospitals with good diagnostics? And if so, is there a possible connection with NDE research? Yes, there may be. And if so, how could the study of terminal lucidity be useful in the study of NDEs and vice versa? And how can we prepare caregivers and family that terminal lucidity might happen? And actually, that's other than the the research aspects of that, this is really important, because this can give tremendous comfort if we can explain something of what's going on with an Alzheimer's patient, particularly that terminal lucidity may happen. Move ahead. So how could the study of terminal lucidity be useful for the study of NDEs and vice versa? Well, there's the phenomenon of mind sight that Kenneth Ring and his co-author, I can't remember now, put forward called mind sight in their book. And it's that it seems like when you're in the out-of-body situation in an NDE, you have much better and different kind of vision and other perceptual qualities than what you ordinarily have. And so if there is a period of lucidity, maybe that's in Alzheimer's, in terminal lucidity, then there may be parallels with an enhanced memory and information processing. And if you think about it, terminal lucidity is part of many NDEs insofar as the physical state that precedes the NDE isn't one of high cognitive function. And there are a lot of things that can trigger an NDE where you are terminal. And it might be informative terminal lucidity might be informative to helping answer questions of when NDEs actually occur in the preceding states. And then, of course, if there are veridical or anomalous cognition in terminal lucidity cases, that would also be very interesting. So the survey study was of nurses, helpers, caretakers, and the primary question was, in the past 12 months, did you ever observe unexpected return to clarity and cognitive function in your Alzheimer's or other dementia patients? And then questions about what was the phenomenology, what were the medical factors, how terminal, how close to terminality were they, medical history, and so on. And the results so far, this is only preliminary data of about 32 caregivers, from about 32 caregivers. There was a low response. Out of 800 questionnaires, 32 responded. And so there's a question of responder selection, and that affects the study results, calls into question, did they not respond because they didn't have anything to report, or they're too busy, or they're not interested, those that didn't respond. The observations on the deathbed of 227 patients, of which 24 showed signs of terminal lucidity, approximately 10%, which is something like what we see. It's a little lower than what we usually see, 15 to 20% for NDEs. So, the primary question, does this happen today? Is this still relevant? And the dependent variable, DV, how many of our responders reported with having witnessed more than one, or no cases of terminal lucidity with their dementia patients in the last 12 months? And the answer is that more than half reported cases. So it does happen today. Yes, it does, but prevalence remains to be studied further, because this is not completely clear exactly how many, because of the low number of respondents. So the problem is, yes, it does happen. The following analysis is based on 24 cases reported in some detail in their study, which occurred between 2013 and 2014. So is there anything special about terminal lucidity? Could it perhaps be that we overestimate the role of impending death and are merely dealing with transient lucidity falsely attributed to death? So the question is, how close does the temporal relationship between lucidity and death look like? How close is the occurrence of lucidity to when they actually die? And note that we were asking about, we mentioned lucidity, not terminal lucidity, transient lucidity, not terminal lucidity. And so, bingo, only 7% had 4 days or more between their lucid events or phenomena and when they actually died. So it is death-related. Terminal lucidity rather than transient lucidity, yes. Third question, how long does the episode last? Got to keep up with myself. So we see, only 4% over 4 hours, only 9% over 2 hours. So the vast majority, 91% happen within a small time window of several minutes to hours. That's the duration of the lucidity, period of lucidity. So the fourth question, perhaps these were light demented cases with some residuals of proper brain functioning to begin with. Is there a relationship between dementia rating and the frequency of terminal lucidity? So the dependent variable is, what's the relationship? And the answer is non-significant tendency towards higher prevalence of terminal lucidity among the more severe cases. That's interesting. Actually, you would say, well, if they're going to be lucid, then they would not be have very severe dementia. But actually, it works the other way. The more severe cases tend to be, although it's not a significant tendency, towards a higher prevalence of terminal lucidity. So the fifth question, anomalous elements, transcendent elements. And here there's the problem of definition. What do you call anomalous? So non-sensory perception, non-informed knowing something you didn't know before, or maybe nobody else knew. But for Alzheimer's, memory is anomalous. So if you remember something, you have dementia and you remember something, that's an anomaly. So there's a problem of defining anomalous cognition when cognition itself is close to a miracle given what we know about brain function and cognition. And here it is a good illustration of what we know in terms of brain physiology and presumably also almost certainly brain function, is that a healthy brain looks like what's on the left, and a severe Alzheimer's disease patient looks like what's on the right. So there's a question when you talk about anomalies, it becomes, there are some ambiguous cases and less ambiguous cases. So here's a case. An elderly lady with advanced AD did not recognize a nurse nor a picture frame of children, both who died in a car accident a few years before. Patient no longer initiated conversations, stereotypical movements, etc. Dementia. On the day of her death, the nurse entered the patient's room to find the patient smiling and greeting the nurse, saying to the nurse, "Ah, there you are, sweetheart," and then she points to the picture frame. "Peter and Krista have come to pick me up, finally." Then she fell asleep, never to wake up again. So is this a case of hallucination, being incoherent? Well, you can't tell, it's ambiguous. But in these cases, we have to recognize that they are untypically orderly, calm, meaningful, and coherent. So even though the patient has dementia and has been incoherent for many months, years, decades, now they are responding, yes, maybe it's a hallucination, but it is orderly, calm, meaningful, coherent. And it's based on memory traces that have been lost for years. Oops, wrong way. Sorry. So here's another case, also somewhat ambiguous. An elderly lady with advanced AD, disoriented, mute, no longer recognizes brother or children. 4 months before, her husband died of a heart attack. She was told but did not understand or remember her husband's death. A week later, in the evening hours, she sat up in bed, reached out her hand, Urs, the name of her husband. She listened, nodded, and whispered, "Yes, yes, ready." And she died. So is that incoherent, hallucination? But again, it's orderly, calm, meaningful, coherent, with memory traces. So even though this is ambiguous, it certainly points in a direction. And another case that is less ambiguous, an elderly man, advanced Parkinson's with cognitive decline, no longer recognizes people, non-expressive. An hour before he died, he looked at one corner of the room, smiled happily, took the hand of his nurse, whispered, "Thank you for caring for me," and died. So here is a return to coherence and pretty evident knowledge of impending death. And another case, which is actually closer to like the clear-cut textbook cases of terminal lucidity, an elderly woman with dementia, almost mute, no longer recognizes people, non-expressive. Unexpectedly, one day, she called her daughter and thanked her for everything. Now, let's go back. She has dementia, she's almost mute, no longer recognizes people, non-expressive. She calls up her daughter and thanks her for everything, and has a phone conversation with grandchildren, exchanged kindness and warmth, and then said farewell, and shortly afterwards she died. So here is coherent, sensible behavior, clearly with a knowledge of impending death. And I think this one is particularly telling. This is the other side of terminal lucidity, the caregiver's perspective. This is a nurse who takes care of dementia patients. Before this happened, I had become fairly cynical about the human vegetables I cared for. Now I understand that I'm caring for nurslings of immortality. Had you seen what I saw, you would understand that dementia can affect the soul, but it will not destroy it. I only wish I would have known this earlier. And I would like to hark back to Viktor Frankl's noetic person, that the credo to believe that despite everything that is happening with the mental illness of the patient, you believe in the noetic person behind the illness. Now, we could go back to Paul Edwards and Mrs. D. What would we say if Paul Edwards, Mrs. D, had an episode of terminal lucidity? Is it that Mrs. D would have had an episode of mental confusion rather than an episode of terminal lucidity? In other words, is terminal lucidity just further mental confusion? And this bears on the natural state of the mind and soul. And ontologically speaking, what is our measure of lucidity or confusion? And this is somewhat philosophical, but Dr. Batthyany wants to point to Spinoza. Spinoza, philosopher, pointed out that you can have light without shadow, but you can't have shadow without light. And lucidity is the mind's normal state, the light. And confusion and dementia is an active disturbance of the normal state. And another example of that is you can have truth without error. You can have truth without error. For example, mathematical truth. But error is a function of truth. It's a deviation from truth. So it's more appropriate to consider Alzheimer's disease as a long-term confused state, and terminal lucidity, rather than being an abnormal state, is more a return to a normal state of mind, regardless of how long the Alzheimer's disease has existed. So to sum this all up, terminal lucidity appears to be a real phenomenon, but we do not yet know how often it really happens, so we need prospective studies going forward and looking at all cases of patients who have died of dementia. And terminal lucidity needs to be fairly brief, tends to be fairly brief. There's only a small time window, hence it is easy to miss terminal lucidity, particularly if you do not expect it, and very few do. I imagine that hospice nurses will recognize that, oh yes, so-and-so has become suddenly lucid, and therefore we can expect that person to die soon. But most of us, including family and most medical professionals, probably do not expect it. And even severely demented patients may experience terminal lucidity to a degree which mimics full recovery of cognitive function. So you have somebody whose brain looks like what that picture looked like, who is now fully cognitively functional. There is no correlation between dementia rating and the occurrence of terminal lucidity. Very interesting. There are some anomalous, otherworldly elements to terminal lucidity, and phenomenologically, these seem to be very different from psychotic or delirious states. For example, the visions they have are meaningful rather than hallucinations. And finally, there's no definable causes for terminal lucidity that have been found, and neither is the mechanism understood. But the preliminary results are very promising. There's about 4,000 more surveys that need to be sent out, hopefully filled out, so we will keep you informed. And in the service of understanding, please let us know if you ever experienced, witnessed, or saw terminal lucidity or anything else relevant. Please let us know, and that is his email address. So thank you for listening, and oops.
Although this may be transient lucidity, remember the doctor who wrote Musicophilia and about Sicorius, but he often came across cases where people who had it, and when they would listen to music, all of a sudden they didn't know anything, and they would know the words to the song and start singing it, and they had never, it had been maybe years since they were able to do that. Would you call that transient lucidity? And they were probably not necessarily close to death, but it's sort of the same type of phenomenon, isn't it?
Right. There are cases. Well, you may have combined several cases. So, at least one of these cases is where there is a person who is very severely mentally challenged with not Alzheimer's, but anyway, severely mentally challenged, and yet they have abilities that are there which they did not, nobody taught them the musical abilities that they have. And yes, it's not the terminal lucidity, but that could be, and it probably isn't transient, actually. It probably goes, can continue. But they are, they would be called savants, I guess, who are very capable in certain relatively narrow domains of cognition, but where they are capable, they are very capable. And so that may be, that sort of thing. And when it comes out, then it's striking. All of a sudden, you put somebody in front of an instrument and they can play it. That's very interesting. It's not quite the same as terminal lucidity. We have another question?
I don't know if it's so much a question as it is, well, yeah, it is a question. Same sort of topic. I was at school for my psych degree, and one of the things I was being taught about dementia and Alzheimer's was the different structures of the brain and where certain things take place. My grandfather was diagnosed with dementia and was actually in an assisted living care. And one of the things they told me about was see if he can recognize anything through his senses. So we were out, I strolled him out into the park and grabbed a rose and put it to his nose. And he smelled it and he started singing songs from the past. And it was so interesting, and I told my grandma about it because she wasn't there. So my grandmother said she would take him out to the park and let him smell a rose, and he would start singing, even though he was clinically diagnosed with the dementia. Is that what you mean by TL?
I would say, well, the definition of TL is, I don't know that they have defined a time limit, but that seems like it's more transient lucidity.
Yeah.
And it may be that depending upon the brain functions, the olfactory centers are different, in a totally different place than memory and ordinary cognition. And so those faculties may still have been there, and even though the patient has aphasia, can't speak, they can still sing because the right hemisphere is usually the side where there's the singing ability, music ability, may still be functional. So that may be still areas of the brain that are still functional.
So maybe I'm not clear then, because is this the sort of thing that you guys are looking for if I was to email This gentleman?
I would, yes.
Okay.
I would recommend that you do that and let them decide, because one of the things that I have found in looking at cases of shared death experiences I talked about yesterday is that you have an idea of what the phenomenon is, and then somebody comes out and with a case that doesn't fit your idea. You got to expand your idea, and then another one you got to expand it, and you got to expand it over here, and so they need all of these cases,
Okay.
and then they can say, okay, well, we will call what this phenomenon is based on perhaps on terminality. In other words, how close to death the patient was, or maybe not. So
Right.
they need your case.
Okay, and another one, my father had chemotherapy, and he passed away from it soon thereafter, but he had cognitive, they call it chemo brain?
Yeah,
Is that TL too?
No, those are transient. Hopefully they're transient.
Right.
Okay, or if they are not transient, it might be brain damage caused by the chemotherapy. But if it's transient and it has a definite cause, it was caused by the drugs, then it probably would not qualify for that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming.